1432, $43. I want to tell you about a number. $43. That's how much money I had in my wallet the night my parents told me I wasn't their problem anymore. I know the exact amount because I had counted it at a red light, 2 20s, 3 1s, while my daughters slept in their car seats behind me. Grace in the back left, 3 years old, arms folded across her chest the way she always slept. May in the back right, 14 months old, head tipped sideways, mouth slightly open, both of them completely unaware that the world had just split open. My brain was doing what brains do in crisis, counting things, cataloguing, staying useful while the rest of me came apart. $43, 2 daughters, 0 plan, and a porch I'd just been turned away from that I would spend the next 14 years trying to forget. Here's what I didn't know that night. Pulling out of my parents' driveway in the dark, 14 years later, I would stand on a stage in front of 300 people in the Texas Hill Country and say 2 names out loud into a microphone. And when I said those names, the entire crowd would stand up. And about 40 feet to my left, my mother's face would do something I'd waited a very long time to see. But we're not there yet. Let me take you back to where this actually starts. My name is Edward Conlin. I'm 38 years old. And by the time this story is over, you're going to understand why the $12 million was never really the point. My wife's name was Laura Conlin, born Laura Whitfield, from a ranching family in Fredericksburg, Texas. She was 27 years old when she died on October 3rd, 2010, from a brain aneurysm that announced itself at 6:48 in the morning while she was making oatmeal in our kitchen in San Marcos. She was here, and then she wasn't. No warning, no preparation, no last conversation that we knew was the last. We'd been married 4 years. Our daughters, Grace, who had just turned 3, and May, who was 14 months old, were still asleep in their room when it happened. Grace knew something was wrong because of the sound I made when I found Laura on the kitchen floor. That sound is the one thing I'm grateful she doesn't remember. I was 24 years old. I had a construction estimating job that paid $41,000 a year. I had a rented house with 17 days left on the lease. I had 2 daughters who needed feeding every few hours, and a grief so total it felt structural, like it was load-bearing. Like removing it would bring the whole building down. No life insurance. We were young. We thought we had time. The hospital released me at 2 o'clock in the afternoon with a folder of paperwork and the phone number of a grief counselor. I never called because I couldn't figure out which hour of the day to fit that into. I sat in the parking lot for 45 minutes, the engine running, the radio off, the 2 car seats behind me, carrying the 2 people I was now solely responsible for keeping alive. Then I drove to my parents' house. My parents, Dennis and Carol Conlin, lived in a brick colonial on a cul-de-sac in the Canyon Lake area, about 40 minutes from San Marcos. Dennis was 54, retired early from a career in municipal water management. Carol was 52, did part-time bookkeeping for a local insurance office. They had a 4-bedroom house. 2 of those bedrooms were empty. My younger sister Kristen had moved to Austin 2 years earlier. I want to be precise about something, because some people hear a story like mine and assume the parents must have been monsters from the beginning. Mine weren't. Not exactly. They were the kind of people who were generous when it was comfortable and scarce when it wasn't. They loved the way some people love conditionally, proportionally with an invisible ledger running in the background that they would have sworn didn't exist. I pulled into their driveway at 3:15 p.m. Grace was awake in the back seat, quiet in the way she'd been since the hospital parking lot. May was asleep. I went to the door and knocked. My mother opened it with a dish towel over her shoulder, looked at my face, and knew. She knew. And she still stepped outside, rather than in. I told her Laura was gone. I told her about the aneurysm. I told her about the lease ending in 17 days. And then I asked, I want to be clear that I asked, because I needed her to understand this was a request, not an assumption, if the girls and I could stay with them while I sorted out what came next. My mother looked at the car, then at me, then at the car again. Ed, she folded the dish towel, your father and I, we're not set up for this right now. We just got into a routine. 2 small children. Mum, The words came out quieter than I felt. Laura died this morning. I know, sweetheart, I know. And it's terrible. But we raised our kids. We paid our time. Your father's blood pressure. 3 weeks. 2 weeks. I just need a floor, and I'll figure it out. She looked at the dish towel. My father appeared at the door behind her. He looked at me. He looked at my mother. He did not look at the car where his grandchildren were sitting. His answer came with the particular cruelty of a man who believes he's being reasonable. It's not a good time, son. You're a grown man. You'll figure it out. And my mother added quietly, as though offering context. We can't be your rescue. Every time life gets hard, Edward. Every time. As though I had a history of showing up at their door. As though this was a pattern and not the worst morning of my life. I stood on that porch for a moment longer than I should have. Waiting, I can see that now, for one of them to change their mind, to look past me at those 2 little girls in the car and be moved by something more than inconvenience. They didn't. I walked back to the car. I buckled myself in. Grace asked where we were going. Grandma and Grandpa Whitfield, I told her. She asked if they had horses. Yes. She accepted that. Turned and looked out the window. I pulled out of the driveway and drove south on US 290 toward Fredericksburg, 40 miles in the October dark. And I want to be honest, I didn't call ahead, because I had just watched one set of grandparents decide my daughters weren't worth the inconvenience, and I wasn't prepared to find out the score was 2 for 2. I pulled onto the Whitfield property at 5:40 p.m. as the last of the October light went gold over the cedar and live oak. Frank Whitfield, Laura's father, 58 years old, lean and weathered in the way that men get after 3 decades of working land, was coming out of the barn when my headlights swept the drive. He stopped. He looked at the car. He came toward me before I even opened the door. I got out. I didn't know how to start. He took one look at my face and said, Ed. Just my name. The way people say it when they already know. She's gone. Frank. He put his hand on the back of my neck the way fathers do, or the way some fathers do, and held it there for a moment without saying a word. Then he pulled back, looked at the car, and said, Get those girls inside. Norma's got dinner on. 4 words. No conditions. No speech about routines or blood pressure or what they'd signed up for. Get those girls inside. Norma Whitfield, Laura's mother, 56 years old, a woman who ran a 200-acre cattle and horse operation alongside her husband and still found time to make the best biscuits in. Gillespie County opened the back door of my car before I'd even reached it. She unbuckled May from the car seat and held her against her shoulder and looked at me over the baby's head with wet eyes and a set jaw. The face of a woman deciding to hold herself together for the sake of people who needed her to. You're going to eat something. It was not a suggestion. I sat at the Whitfield kitchen table that night and ate a bowl of beef stew I couldn't taste because grief does that, flattens everything sensory into a kind of grey static. But I ate it because Norma had set it in front of me, and that felt like the minimum I could do to honour what she was offering. Grace ate most of hers and asked if she could see the horses in the morning. Frank told her she could name one of the new colts if she wanted. Grace thought about it very seriously and said the colt's name should be Butterscotch. Frank wrote it on the notepad and told her it was official. That night, they put the girls in the room that had been Laura's growing up. Pink curtains, a bookshelf full of horse figurines, a rag rug on the hardwood that Norma had braided herself one winter. I slept on a pull-out sofa in the study, a stack of quilts pulled over me, a nightlight on in the hall so May wouldn't wake up scared in the new place. I didn't sleep much, but I wasn't alone. Under 24 years old, with 2 daughters and $43, not being alone was the whole world. I want to pause here for a second and say something about the Whitfields, because it matters to everything that comes after. Frank and Norma were not wealthy people, not in the way that makes charity easy. The Whitfield operation was a working cattle and horse ranch, 200 acres of hill country land outside Fredericksburg, running about 60 head of Hereford Angus cross cattle and a small remuda of working quarter horses. Frank had supplemented with some recreational horseboarding to manage the margins. Norma ran the books with the same no-nonsense efficiency she applied to everything else. The ranch turned a modest profit most years. Enough to stay, not enough to get comfortable. When they took us in, they weren't doing it from a position of abundance. They were doing it because a 24-year-old widower with 2 toddlers had pulled into their driveway in the dark. And that was reason enough. I told Frank in the first week that I wanted to earn my keep not as a favor, but as a condition I'd set for myself. Because I came from people who believed in ledgers, and I couldn't fully shake that yet, even when I was trying to. Frank put me to work on the fence line along the south boundary, straightforward physical labor. The kind that keeps your body busy while your mind is doing something else. Grace adapted to ranch life with a speed that still amazes me. She was 3, resilient in the way only small children can be, because they live entirely in the present tense. And the present tense at the Whitfield place was horses, dogs, biscuits, and a grandmother who had more patience than I would have believed possible. May was too young to understand what had changed. To her, Norma was simply the warm arms that were always there. I want to be careful here, because I know how this sounds. 2 grieving little girls take to a ranch and find a new family. It's easy to tell that as a soft story. But it wasn't soft. Every night for the first year, I got the girls to sleep and then sat outside on the porch steps and carried a weight I wouldn't wish on anybody. I missed Laura in the specific physical way you miss a person who was supposed to be there for every ordinary thing the school. Forms. The bedtime negotiations. The Tuesday mornings. Not just the big moments. The Tuesday mornings. What the Whitfields gave us was not a replacement for any of that. They couldn't replace Laura. They never tried. What they gave us was structure when we had none, presence when we needed it, and the quiet. Consistent message delivered not in words, but in set plates and named colts and nightlights left on in hallways that we were worth showing up for. My parents called twice in the first 6 months. The first call was my mother checking in with the slightly guilty energy of a person who knows they made a wrong choice, but hasn't quite admitted it to themselves yet. The second call was my father, asking whether I'd found a new place yet. The question framed in a way that made its subtext clear. When are you going to stop being a problem? I told him I was figuring it out. He said that was good. We hung up. Over the next 3 years, my parents made occasional appearances. Holidays, Grace's birthday in year 2, a brief visit when May started walking. They were pleasant enough, asked the right questions, brought appropriate gifts, and every time there was a studied quality to their warmth, as though they had rehearsed being the kind of people who showed up, rather than actually being them. I never said this out loud, I just noticed it the way you notice a structural crack. Not urgent, not dramatic, just evidence of something running underneath. The Whitfields noticed it too. Norma said nothing, not one word, not one eyebrow raise about my parents. That restraint was itself a form of grace. 3 years after Laura died, in 2013, Frank sat me down at the kitchen table one Sunday morning after the girls had got out of the paddock with Norma. He spread a legal plat across the table, the 200-acre survey, the boundary lines, the soil classifications, and explained that he and Norma were getting older. The ranch needed a plan, and the plan they'd agreed on was this. If I was willing to commit fully to taking the operation over, bringing my engineering background to the business side, grow it deliberately, he would begin transferring operational authority to me now, with full ownership to vest over 10 years. We're not giving it away, Frank said, with the directness of a man who thinks sentiment is fine, but clear terms are better. You take on the mortgage note and the operating liability. But we'll be here, and the land is yours to build on. I looked at the plat for a long moment. Why me? Not falsely modest, genuinely asking. Frank looked at me the way he'd looked at me that first night in the driveway. Because Laura saw something in you, and because I've watched you for 3 years, and you work hard, you're honest, and you don't run from things that are difficult. A pause. Also, Grace named that colt Butterscotch, and it stuck. And I figure anyone connected to that decision has some commitment to this place. I laughed. First real laugh in longer than I could track. Okay, I said. Let's build something. Building something turned out to be a 14-year project, which, in hindsight, makes complete sense. Anything worth building takes longer than you think and costs more than you planned. And there is always a moment somewhere in the middle where you seriously consider whether the whole thing was a mistake. Mine came in 2016. By then, I'd been running the Whitfield operation, which I'd quietly begun calling Conlin Whitfield Ranch in the operating documents, with Frank's blessing, for 3 years. I'd used my engineering background to redesign the water infrastructure, adding a rainwater harvesting system that cut irrigation costs significantly. I'd grown the horseboarding from 6 stalls to 18, with a dedicated training arena on the north end of the property. The cattle herd had grown to 90 head. Revenue was up 40% over the 2013 baseline. I had also, quietly and carefully, started breeding quarter horses for performance, specifically cutting and reining. The hill country has a long tradition of working horse events, and the performance quarter horse market, when you know the bloodlines and you're patient, can be extraordinarily profitable. I knew the bloodlines. Frank had taught me. I was patient because I didn't have a choice. The 2016 crisis was operational. A drought hit Gillespie County hard enough that the hay market tripled overnight. We lost 12 head of cattle to heat stress. The bank called to discuss the operating line of credit in terms that were not really a discussion. I was 30 years old, 2 girls in elementary school, staring at a spreadsheet that told me I was 6 months from not being able to make payroll. I spread that spreadsheet across the same kitchen table where Frank had once spread the plat, and I told them exactly where we stood. Frank looked at the numbers. Norma looked at me. "What do you need?" Frank said. "Time. And about 80,000 in bridge capital to get through the hay season and restructure the feed contracts." "Where are you going to get it?" "I have a plan. But I need to know you're both okay with more risk before I move forward." Frank looked at Norma. Norma looked at Frank. Something passed between them that had no words in it. Then Frank looked back at me. "We're in this together. What's the plan?" The plan was a calculated risk. I had a 4-year-old quarter horse stallion, registered name High Point Ranger. Cool name, Ranger. Out of a breeding line I'd been quietly developing since 2014. Ranger had won 2 NRHA reining events as a 3-year-old and had the bloodlines and the movement to be a serious breeding prospect. I hadn't listed him for stud because I'd planned to wait until he had more competition record. The drought changed the math. I listed Ranger for performance sale at a regional auction in San Antonio that September. I drove him there myself. Grace, riding in the passenger seat at 10 years old, with a hand-lettered sign she'd made that said, "Go Ranger," which I made her keep in the truck because I felt it might undercut the professional atmosphere. Ranger sold for $340,000 to a buyer from the King Ranch operation in Kingsville. We made payroll. We paid down the operating line. We survived the drought year. And I sat in that truck outside the sale barn for a long moment after the check cleared and thought about what my father had said to me in 2010. "You're a grown man. You'll figure it out." He meant it as a dismissal. It had turned out to be accidentally accurate. Between 2016 and 2022, the ranch grew in ways I hadn't fully projected when I drew up the 10-year plan. The performance breeding program became the primary revenue engine, producing horses that competed and placed consistently at major NRHA and NCHA events, the National Reining Horse Association and the National Cutting Horse Association, 2 of the premier performance horse circuits in the country. A placing horse in those circuits doesn't just win prize money, it builds a bloodline reputation that multiplies stud fees and offspring sale values over years. By 2020, the ranch, now formally titled Conlin Whitfield Performance Horses, LLC, had a waiting list for breeding contracts and had produced 3 horses that sold above $400,000 each. Frank and Norma stayed in the house on the property. That was always the arrangement. Frank's health had begun to slow by 2022. Nothing dramatic, but the knees and the back that come with decades of ranch work were making themselves known. Norma was still sharp as a fence wire, running the breeding records with the same precision she'd applied to everything for 30 years. Grace, 16 in 2023, had grown up on that land and worked it with a confidence that still made me catch my breath. The way she moved around horses, calm, unhurried, certain like she'd been born to it. May 14th was quieter about the ranch, but equally absorbed in it. She had developed an interest in the genetics and data side. tracking bloodline performance metrics with a spreadsheet precision that I could only describe as unsettlingly good for a 14-year-old. Laura would have loved watching this. I thought that often, usually in the evenings, when the light went gold over the cedar and the horses moved in the near pasture and the house smelled like dinner. Laura would have been insufferably proud, and she would have given me a hard time about everything I'd gotten wrong along the way, which would have been its own kind of gift. In early 2023, I was approached by a private equity real estate group based in Austin that had been quietly acquiring hill country ranch properties for a larger consolidated development project, high-end recreational land use, luxury equestrian retreat, the category of project that the Texas hill country had become increasingly attractive for due to proximity to Austin and San Antonio. The first approach was informal, a phone call from a broker I'd met at a Fredericksburg chamber event. He told me there was buyer interest in hill country horse operations with existing infrastructure and wanted to know if I'd be open to a conversation. I told him I'd listen. 4 months later, after retaining a transactional attorney in Austin named Philip Hartley, I arrived at a number that, when Philip put it in writing and slid it across the conference table, made the room feel slightly tilted. $12 million for the land, the improvements, the infrastructure, and the operating business assets, the breeding bloodline archive, the genetic documentation, the registration records, the competition history transferred separately in a licensing arrangement that allowed me to continue a smaller breeding operation, if I chose. The farmhouse and 2 acres surrounding it were excluded from the sale, an irrevocable reservation I'd insisted on in the very first structuring conversation. Frank and Norma's home stayed theirs. That was non-negotiable from the beginning, and it never came up again after I made it clear. I signed the agreement on March 14th, 2024. I was 38 years old. My parents found out about the sale the way most people in my extended circle did, through a brief item in the Fredericksburg Standard, which ran in late March 2024. It mentioned the sale price. It mentioned my name. My mother called that same afternoon. I let it ring. She left a voicemail. It was warm, warmer than anything she'd left in the previous 14 years. She talked about the news, about pride, about the too long gap. She and Dennis would love to come to the celebration, she said, if we were planning one. The celebration she'd heard we were planning. I stood in the kitchen and listened to that voicemail twice. Then I called Grace into the kitchen and told her what I was thinking about doing. Grace is 16. She listened the way she always listens, still and complete. The way her mother used to. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Do Frank and Norma know? Not the full plan. Not yet. Are you going to tell them before? No. I want their reaction to be real. She thought about it. Okay. Then, Dad, Grandma Carol's going to make a face. I know. I want to see it. Me too, kiddo. The celebration was scheduled for Saturday, April 27th, 2024, on the ranch grounds, technically the last weekend before the buyer's formal possession date, which meant the land was still mine, and I could use it for one final event. 300 guests, catered by a hill country barbecue outfit out of Johnson City. A temporary stage set up near the old training arena. Frank had wanted a tent in case of rain. I'd told him to trust April. He'd given me the look of a man who has farmed in Central Texas for 4 decades and knows better than to trust April. He was right. There was a brief rain shower around noon that cleared out by 2 p.m. and left everything smelling like cedar and wet limestone. That smell, I will tell you, is the best smell in the world. My parents arrived at 1:45. Dennis's truck pulling up the drive I'd had resurfaced the previous fall. My mother had her hair done. She was wearing a blouse I didn't recognize. My father had on his good boots. They walked in with the energy of people who had been thinking about this moment and had decided to treat it as a homecoming. My sister Kristen was there too, having driven down from Austin with her husband Tom. Kristen and I had maintained a relationship over the years that was honest, if not close. She knew broadly how things had gone in 2010. She hadn't been the one who turned me away, but she also hadn't been the one who pushed back on the people who did. At some point, you have to make peace with that category of person, not the perpetrators, just the witnesses who decided the cost of speaking up was too high. I'd made that peace, mostly. Kristen hugged me when she arrived and said she was proud of me. I believed her. My parents found me near the stage, about 30 minutes before the program started. My mother hugged me and held on longer than she usually did. My father shook my hand and said, "Son, what you've built here." His voice had something in it I didn't recognize right away. Then I placed it. It was pride. Genuine, unqualified pride. And here's the complicated thing, the thing I want to be honest about. It landed. Even now, even after everything, it landed. Because that's what fathers do when they finally say the thing you needed. They say it too late, and it still means something, and you have to figure out how to hold both of those things at the same time. I told them I was glad they could make it. I meant it in the way you mean things that are true and also insufficient. I didn't tell them what was coming. The program started at 3 p.m. Philip Hartley stood at the podium first, ran through a brief business summary context for the transaction, the history of the ranch, the scope of the sale. He was precise and unhurried, the way good attorneys are. Then I walked up. 300 people, hill country neighbors, horse industry contacts, auction house representatives, editors from Western Horseman and the Quarter Horse Journal, Frank and Norma's church community, the girls' school friends, ranch hands who'd worked with us over the years, people who had shown up for this land in one way or another. Frank and Norma were in the front row. Frank had his good hat on. Norma was sitting perfectly straight, with her hands folded in her lap, the way she sits when she's trying not to show she's nervous. They still didn't know. I looked at them for a moment before I started speaking. Then I began with the ranch, the land, what it had taught me, what I had put into it, what it had given back. I kept that part short because the people in this crowd already knew the story and didn't need a summary. What they didn't know was what came next. Before we finalize anything today, I said, I want to announce two things that matter more to me than any transaction. I nodded to my left. A banner unfurled from the stage rigging. Clean, bold, right. I'd worked on the design with a graphic firm in Austin for 3 weeks. The Laura Conlin Foundation for Rural Family Stability. I heard Norma make a sound. I kept my eyes on the banner for a moment. My late wife, Laura Whitfield Conlin, grew up on this land. She loved it. She left it behind too young. She left 2 daughters and a husband who didn't know what to do with himself. I let that sit. The foundation is funded at $5 million from the sale proceeds. Its purpose is to provide emergency support and resources to families in rural communities facing sudden hardship specifically. Families who have lost a primary earner and need a bridge to something stable. Because in October 2010, my family needed that bridge, and the people who built it for us are sitting right there. I pointed directly at Frank and Norma. The crowd turned. Frank put his hand on Norma's. Frank and Norma Whitfield took in a 24-year-old widower with 2 toddlers on the worst night of his life. They didn't ask what we could do for them. They set 2 more plates. They handed my daughters a home and handed me a purpose. And they asked for nothing in return. A pause. Not in 14 years. Not once. I let that land. So the second announcement is this. The farmhouse and the 2 acres surrounding it, the parcel reserved from the sale, will be transferred by deed to Frank and Norma Whitfield this week, free, clear, and in perpetuity. Their home, always. The crowd rose. Not politely, actually rose the way people stand when something moves them before they've decided to. Frank looked straight ahead. He was doing the thing men of his generation do when they're trying not to cry in public. Jaw set. Blink slow. Breathe through it. Norma was not attempting that discipline. She was crying freely, and I loved her for it. I found their eyes and held them for a moment. Thank you. It's not enough. It's what I've got. I want to tell you about a specific detail in my peripheral vision during that applause, because it's the part that earned its place in this story. My parents were standing about 15 feet to the left of the stage. I could see them without looking directly at them. My mother's face had arrived at this event with a particular expression. The expression of a woman who expected to be welcomed into a success story she could claim some adjacency to. Our son. Look what he built. During the part about October 2010, that expression moved. During the part about 2 plates being set, it moved again. During the part about Frank and Norma, through the banner, through the deed announcement, through the crowd rising around her, it went through several phases I can only describe as a controlled demolition. Slow at first, then faster, then a settled kind of stillness that wasn't peace. It was something more permanent than peace. It was reckoning. My father looked at the stage, then at Frank and Norma, then at the banner with Laura's name on it, then at me. I held his gaze for exactly as long as felt honest. Then I looked back at Frank and Norma, because they were the ones who deserved my eyes. After the applause settled, I stepped to the microphone one last time. Family, I said, quietly, into a crowd that had gone still, is not who shares your name. It's who shows up when showing up is the only thing that matters. The night my daughters and I arrived on Frank and Norma's porch, they didn't evaluate whether we were a burden. They just opened the door. A beat. I've spent 14 years trying to deserve that. I stepped back. My mother found me near the catering tables about 40 minutes later. She'd been working up to the approach I'd seen her circling at a distance, recalibrating. She started with a tribute to Laura, how beautiful it was. Then she stopped, tried again. Edward, I want you to know your father and I, we think about that time. We think about what we should have. Mum, I kept my voice level. I'm not angry at you. I want you to understand that I mean that. The anger had burned down to something quieter and more permanent over 14 years. Not forgiveness, exactly. Not bitterness, exactly. Just clarity. What you did in 2010 told me something true about what I could count on, and I built my life from what I actually had, not from what I wished I had. That worked out. She looked at me. Something in her face was still working through it. She tried once more, quieter. The girls, could there be a way to know them better now? It was the right question. 14 years too late, and still the right one. That's up to them, I said. Grace is 16, May is 14. They have their own opinions about what they want. If you want a relationship with them, you ask them directly, not me. She nodded twice. The nod of a person accepting terms they know they have no standing to negotiate. My father came over and stood beside her. He looked at me for a long moment. Then the words came, slow and deliberate. I was wrong. In 2010, what we did was wrong. 6 words. 14 years in the making. I let them sit for a moment, because they deserved to sit. I know, I said. I know you were. That was enough. Not a reconciliation, not a repair, but an acknowledgement witnessed by nothing but the two of us that what happened was real, and he knew it. That mattered to me in a way I hadn't fully expected. There is a category of people in the world who measure their generosity against what it costs them. Helping someone is a transaction. I extend something. I am owed something. And if the balance doesn't work out in their favor, they don't extend it. My parents were these kinds of people. Not cruel, not malicious, just transactional. When I showed up at their door in 2010 with 2 daughters and nothing, they ran the numbers and decided I didn't pencil out. And then there is the other category. The Frank and Norma Whitfields of the world, people who operate from a different set of premises entirely. To them, a person in need is simply that, a person in need. The calculation is not what do I get, it's what does this person need and can I provide it? The debt runs in one direction, not from the helped to the helper, but from the helped to the world, to be paid forward when the opportunity comes. That is a different way to live. It is also, as it turns out, what actually builds a life worth living. The Laura Conlon Foundation gave out its first grant that September, $18,000, to a 26-year-old single father in Kerrville, Texas, who had lost his wife to a cardiac event 6 months earlier and was trying to keep his 2 sons in the house they'd lived in since, before the boys could remember. He'd applied with a 2-page letter. May had flagged the application for the review committee. She hadn't told me why, just that it was worth reading. When Susan Park, the foundation's executive director, sent me the application summary, I understood immediately. There was a line about sitting in a hospital parking lot afterwards, counting what he had. The number was $43. Different man, different parking lot, different state, but the same $43. The same instinct to count things when your brain is trying to stay useful while the rest of you comes apart. I put my phone face down on the counter and stood at the kitchen window for a while. Then I called Susan and told her we were approving the full amount. Same afternoon, no committee vote needed. Someone should have done this for me. I told her. Now we do it for others. Norma called me the morning after the celebration. Before I'd even had coffee. She's always up early, always will be. Edward. Hey. Norma. The house. Yes. You didn't have to do that. I know. But you did. Yes. A long pause. Then, Laura would have liked watching you figure all this out, you know. I had to take a breath before I answered. Yeah, I think she also would have given me a hard time about everything I got wrong along the way. Norma laughed the specific laugh of someone who knew Laura Whitfield from birth and recognized the accuracy of that statement. Completely. Oh, Lord. She would have. Every single thing. Grace turned 17 in October 2024. We had a small dinner at Frank and Norma's, the house that was now officially, legally, permanently theirs. Norma made biscuits. Frank grilled. May got into an extended argument with Grace about the correct name for the colour of the sunset, which somehow escalated to involve a colour wheel May had pulled up on her phone. I sat at that table and watched my daughters, one arguing confidently about mauve versus rose gold, one pointing at a phone screen as legal evidence, and I thought about a kitchen floor in San Marcos in October 2010, about a parking lot, about $43 counted at a red light, about a man who came out of the barn in the headlights and said my name like he already knew. The $12 million bought us the deed and the foundation and the house for Frank and Norma. What it couldn't buy, what couldn't be purchased at any number, was what was already at that table. What had been built slowly over 14 years by people who never once asked what they were going to get for it. My father said I'd figure it out. He was right. I just needed the right people to figure it out with.